Okay, everyone, thank you for joining today for the UT Energy Symposium here on November 2nd. I am your host for today, Carrie King, research scientist and assistant director for the Energy Institute here at the University of Texas. And before I introduce today's speaker, let me just give you a highlight of what is coming up in the next 2 weeks. Next week, we have Jared Babula, who is a senior attorney at the California Energy Commission. He's going to tell us some things that are going on in California in terms of their energy regulation and efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase the use of renewable energy. And then after that, we're going to have Anna Brohl, who is a program director of the of energy leadership at the Clean Energy Leadership Institute, and she's going to give us a view of energy technologies and how these play out in our options for future energy scenarios. But today it's my pleasure to introduce Todd Snitchler, who is president and CEO of the Electric Power Supply Association, or EPSA. And the title of his talk is Toward a Reliable and Competitive Energy Future, Competitive Power Sector Trends, Progress and Challenges. So just a little bit of background on Todd. He's been the president of EPSA for 3 years now. And before leading EPSA in its goals for advocating for policies that focus on achieving and maintaining well-functioning and properly regulated competitive wholesale electricity markets. So that's their mission. And before he had this role, he was vice president of market development at the American Petroleum Institute. And before that, he's a lawyer. So he's a lawyer by trade, he's a practicing lawyer. And even during his history, perhaps he'll give us some insights. He was an elected official in the state of Ohio and served on the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio. So he's definitely been around the energy and electricity sector and businesses for a long time. And so we're hoping to hear some of his insights today. And with that said, I'm now going to hand it over to Todd and stop sharing my screen. And I will remind everyone that if you want to ask questions, please submit them in the Q&A feature of Zoom, the question and answer feature. And for this particular talk, we'll hold questions to the end, but please submit them at any time so I can have them ready to ask Todd at the end of his talk. So with that said, I now hand it over to Todd for his presentation. And again, Todd, we see the presentation mode now. So if we can perhaps make the correction to normal presentation mode.
Well, it's not letting me see my.
Oh, it's harder when you're sharing your screen, perhaps. So I think you can unshare. Yeah.
Two choices. I chose poorly.
Yeah.
Is that better?
Same presentation mode.
Better?
That is it. That is good.
Perfect. All right. You've now exposed my technological limitations, so we could start with that as full disclosure. Fortunately, I'm not on mute, so I have that going for me. So thank you to Carrie and the University of Texas Austin Energy Symposium for inviting me to participate today. We're really happy to have the chance to share with you a little bit about EPSA and about what we do and how we view where things sit today and where things may be going as we look towards the future. And so I'm certainly appreciative of the opportunity. So, and also look forward to your questions at the end. As Carrie noted, I'm a recovering lawyer, a recovering politician, and a recovering regulator. So I've kind of covered the waterfront. So we'll try to keep it to an hour, and I'll try not to talk too much so as to prevent a good discussion and questions at the very end. So I'm pleased to be here today on behalf of the Electric Power Supply Association and our member companies. And we represent America's competitive power suppliers. And our members include many companies that are located right there in Texas, including BP Energy, Shell Energy, Calpine, Vistra, GenOn, Rockland Capital, and others. My communications director advises me that if I fail to do this, I'm going to be in hot water. So I would like to recommend that if you have interest in energy related issues, that EPSA does a podcast. We're about a half a dozen episodes deep. It's called Energy Solutions. It's hosted by us, and we have conversations with thought leaders around the energy marketplace on a range of issues. And if you're interested in these subjects, I think that'd be very helpful and a useful opportunity for you to learn more in a podcast type setting. So enough advertising about our podcast. I'll do my obligatory slide about EPSA and who we are. And once we do that, then we'll move on to the next, really the meat of the subject. So competitive power generators that are in EPSA's membership bring about 150,000 megawatts of reliable, affordable electricity in all restructured markets around the country. So from California to Texas to the Mid-Atlantic to New England and New York, our members own generation of all types in those markets. And that includes just over 42,000 megawatts of generation in ERCOT, or in the competitive portion of Texas. Across the country, a little bit of a breakdown about our members' assets. About 73% of their resources are natural gas-fired resources. 17% remain coal, although those numbers have changed, as you might imagine, over the last decade. About 3% are oil, and those would be in places like the Northeast and New York, where you would expect that type of resource. Competitive nuclear resources, wind resources, and small but growing numbers of hydro, solar, and geothermal resources, as well as some amount of biomass and growing amounts of storage and battery storage resources around the country. At EPSA, our mission is to advocate for fuel and technology neutral competitive market designs that allow all resources to participate to provide power generation resources that meet reliability, cost, and decarbonization goals. Our members are a key part of the puzzle when it comes to not just providing reliable and affordable power, but also advancing decarbonization and supporting increased electrification. And anyone who's followed the news recently knows that there are big questions about whether Americans will be able to continue to access reliable and affordable power this winter and in the years to come, as we see a global energy situation developing first in Europe, now in Asia, and hopefully not, but potentially even here in the United States. And in Texas, the tragic events surrounding last year's winter storm Yuri hit far too close to home, and I'm sure many of you in the UT Austin community were personally impacted by that storm. So while prices this winter are undoubtedly on the upswing from recent historic lows, we think careful and pragmatic and smart policies can help us get closer to reliable and affordable energy through this energy transition. And competitive power markets and independent generators like those within the EPSA membership will continue to be a cornerstone and really a necessary launch pad for future success. Competition, as you all know, puts downward pressure on prices and encourages innovation, as well as efficient market entry and exit. So resources that need to leave because they're no longer cost competitive, and new lower cost units can come onto the system and have the desired impact of lower costs. Spurred by the shale revolution and low-cost domestic natural gas, competitive markets help drive the transition to a greater use of natural gas and new investment in efficient combined cycle gas turbines and cutting-edge technologies that further take advantage of the environmental benefits provided by natural gas. For example, our member company, Competitive Power Ventures' new award-winning 1,050 megawatt Fairview Energy Center located in Pennsylvania is one of the most efficient combined cycle power plants in the world. It is the very definition of cutting edge, using advanced turbine technology and digital software from General Electric to more efficiently manage its operations. And it is the first and only facility of its scale in the world to blend ethane with natural gas, deploying technologies that are more than twice as efficient as older plants. And all this is while continuing to put downward pressure on emissions. These competitive dynamics also facilitate renewables growth, much of which is done by many of the same companies. So to date, power producers in competitive markets have delivered significant wins for American consumers, for the reliability of our energy infrastructure and the environment by reducing emissions. And they are driven by the spirit of innovation as they work to bring the best solutions to bear in the marketplace. To be sure, this is not purely an altruistic pursuit, but does strike the right balance between the profit motive and truly beneficial outcomes. Some of those outcomes of particular note are worth noting. First, in ERCOT, competition has been a driver of renewables growth and helped reach record levels of wind and solar generation in 2021. And Texas continues to lead the United States in net electricity generation and installed capacity from wind power, And Texas has also been the only state with consistent load growth over the past couple of decades. In the Mid-Atlantic, in the PJM interconnection region, or the nation's largest RTO, emissions have declined 39% since 2005, and emissions in New York State have declined 51% since the New York Independent System Operator launched its competitive marketplace. EPSA member companies have led the way in bringing new clean energy resources and technologies to market throughout the United States, including renewable development, more efficient combined cycle natural gas turbines, and some of the biggest battery storage projects in the world. They've found ways to repurpose former coal sites and other retired resources to build new, cleaner generation. And now some of our members are even exploring offshore wind opportunities. EPSA's member companies also invest in competitive transmission and even electric vehicle charging. So while EPSA as an organization focuses on wholesale power issues, our members are clearly engaged across the energy spectrum. These significant environmental benefits that I mentioned were gained, and new investments were made as competition put downward pressure on pricing, resulting in historically low wholesale power generation prices in PJM and other markets around the country. PJM's markets and its operations are estimated to save between $3.2 and $4 billion annually for consumers. And importantly, in a competitive system, investments in operations are primarily supported through private investment, not through ratepayer pass-throughs or taxpayer subsidies. This shifting of the investment risk is one of the primary benefits of competitive markets. And as we look ahead, there is significant focus on electrification, which we'll talk about, of much of our economy. And doing so will require a significant amount of new generating resources. EPSA commissioned a study that E3 completed for us, where it evaluated the PJM region, which suggests that 50 to 90 gigawatts of new natural gas-fired generation will be required by 2050. Its operational profile will likely be different from how we utilize those resources today, but to ensure reliability, we have to have certain sufficient, firm, and dispatchable resources that will show up when required and are there when they're called upon. It's also clear that a more electrified economy presents significant opportunities for competitive power suppliers to continue our impact by providing competitively priced, efficient, and cleaner generating resources to advance emissions reductions. It also means that there'll be demand for thousands of megawatts of new generating resources, mainly renewables, storage, and highly efficient natural gas units. According to NREL, widespread electrification in the United States will increase consumption increase the demand by 20% by 2050 in the medium case scenario and 38% in the high adoption scenario. That's electricity demand growth that we haven't seen in decades in the United States. Natural gas-fired generation is and will continue to be an indispensable form of firm, flexible, low-emission power to support intermittent renewable resources as demand and market penetration for those resources grows. As I noted a moment ago, the recent study that EPSA commissioned from the Energy, Environment, and Economics, or E3, found that 50 to 90 gigawatts of firm, flexible natural gas generation will be needed to maintain reliability just in the PJM region through 2050, even under deep decarbonization scenarios. A similar scenario exists in New England. E3 did separate work there, not paid for by EPSA, that found that serving electric load reliably requires maintaining sufficient quantities of firm generating capacity up to 46 gigawatts in their high electrification scenario. For reference, New England's current maximum supply is just under 32 gigawatts. So this would represent nearly a doubling of the region's demand under a high electrification scenario. This is likely to increase demand across all regions of the country, and it also highlights concerns about fuel supply or availability to ensure the reliable operation of the grid. And that's not just our opinion. NERC CEO Jim Robb has been very clear from the reliability coordinator seat that NERC has real concerns about fuel supply, deliverability, and particularly in places like New England, which are already constrained by the amount of natural gas that can be delivered into the region due to their pipeline constraints. But that concern isn't limited only to New England. NERC's winter reliability report continues to point to potential reliability concerns while we transition the power system to integrate greater amounts of renewables and the necessary resources needed to pair with them to ensure the greatest degree of reliability. It's also a time for us to mention that a fact-based, data-driven discussion is in order, because we want to ensure that the broader supply chain and energy system are operating from the same set of facts. I'll call it level setting. Even in such progressive states as California and New York, who many look to as leaders in emission reductions and renewables deployment, the reality doesn't yet match the rhetoric. It's often been said that California is close to 100% being powered by renewables. But if you go to the California ISO's app and look at the generation mix, which is provided to you by that organization, by and large, more than 50% of California's power is produced by fossil fuel generation, even with the only exception being when the duck curve or the high amount of solar during the day is providing more power than is actually needed in California, even if those resources, those fossil resources, are from outside of California's borders. What is more, California this fall had to solicit 10 temporary natural gas-fired generating units to ensure their grid's reliability because the existing resources in state were not able to ensure the grid's reliability. Low hydro resources, retirements of some gas-fired units, and the upcoming retirement of a significant nuclear generation station in California will put further stress on their system and on the broader region. These headlines on my slide from May to October of this year show how California has grappled with reliability and taken emergency measures and made special requests of its citizens to add capacity to its grid and to ask them to use less energy. Now, I want you to be sure that you're hearing specifically what I'm saying. California is advancing its zero emission objectives and has every right to do so. However, it is not near as close to reaching that goal as some would suggest, and the path to a zero emission future is potentially rocky and has the potential to create real reliability issues, as we have seen the past 2 summers in California. Careful planning and pragmatism is in order to ensure that we don't sacrifice reliability, which has to be job number 1, and affordability as we transition to a lower emissions grid. And Texas is not immune from reliability challenges, you know well, when the focus is too much on low cost and not balanced appropriately between reliability, affordability, and environmental goals. You know better than I, last winter demonstrated that the entire energy value chain bears responsibility for better coordination and delivery of those much needed resources, even if there's a cost impact, to ensure that lives and property are protected while delivering reliable power when it's needed most. So if we've talked about winter a little bit, what's the winter outlook for 21-22? The FERC just did their winter assessment, and it's important for us to keep an eye on the reliability ball and not take our eyes off of it. There have been a number of recent analyses and observations from regulatory bodies that demand our attention. As I mentioned, FERC did their winter assessment, which suggests that we may have above average temperatures for the winter in much of the United States. And all NERC planning regions expect available generation to exceed reserve margins, meaning there's more generation expected than the demand would be. And transfer capacity between regions is critical to ensure that the lights stay on. Higher natural gas prices, which we've all been reading about in the papers and are experiencing across the United States, are expected to decrease power burn, but increases in other domestic demand and net exports will likely continue to increase natural gas demand. And natural gas and propane storage inventories going into this winter are below their 5-year average. In MISO, or the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator region, which kind of goes north of Texas all the way to the Canadian border, MISO is projecting that there will be adequate firm resources to meet demand this winter, according to their presentation on October 26th. But if there is high demand and high outages, there could be operational issues in January based on their analysis. And finally, PJM is also carefully monitoring the reliability of their system and focusing on the availability of coal for the remaining coal fleet that exists in PJM, as well as sufficient oil and natural gas resources to ensure proper operation of the grid. So reliability remains paramount. And given the experience in Texas, it's clear that there are real concerns about ensuring that proper attention is being paid to those issues. As we think about reliability and where the grid is headed, it's important that we cultivate an environment that encourages innovation that's needed to bring lower carbon, reliable, and least cost resources to support that decarbonization effort. Historically, market competition has been essential to spurring innovation and sending signals that result in less efficient, more expensive resources to retire. This transition to a new generation fleet is clearly already well underway. It's also relevant that we might not be quite as far down that path as some suggest, and not to belabor the point, but it's important to reiterate that even in high renewable penetration, high decarbonization scenarios, all credible studies indicate that a significant amount of natural gas and even some coal resources will need to remain on the system for decades to come. Merely relying on optimistic projections and aspirational goals will not ensure a reliable grid and actually runs the risk of public backlash due to missed expectations about reliability. In my old role as the chairman of the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio, I observed that consumers of all kinds wanted three things: lights on, beer cold, water warm. And I've come to add a fourth of late. They never want to pay more for those things than they did the prior month. That's what they've always paid for their service. Moreover, customers aren't necessarily inclined to voluntarily go without power. The California ISO reported that Californians largely ignored its flex alerts in July when they called for consumers to reduce their usage on the system. Emissions policies that can mitigate the impacts of additional generation demands are broad. There are a number of them, several of which have been under consideration in the current reconciliation bill, which we'll talk about. To ensure that we can meet increased generation demand affordably and reliably, we've got to get energy policy right. And that's never easy. That's the way our member companies will continue to innovate, invest in new technologies, and bring clean and reliable electricity to customers. When it comes to decarbonizing the power sector, policies that focus on reducing emissions while ensuring reliable, least cost solutions will yield the most effective results to meet growing demand for electricity. EPSA, like many others, believes that an economy-wide price on carbon will be the most efficient path and encourage innovation simultaneously. Allowing all resources to compete to reduce emissions while serving reliability needs will best ensure that we can meet the growing demand for electricity while managing costs and keeping the lights on. E3's study that I mentioned before showed that a carbon price could deliver significant emissions reductions, by their calculation, 80 million metric tons by 2030, while saving $2.8 billion annually compared to the current status quo or the business as usual case, which relies upon a hodgepodge of state-specific clean energy policies. In contrast, the business as usual case is projected to increase system costs by $3 billion a year by 2030, while only reducing carbon emissions by 40 million metric tons. The disparity in emissions reductions and costs are substantial. We've also seen that a well-designed clean energy standard can approach the efficiency of a carbon price, but we have a number of recommendations to ensure that that policy is designed to deliver optimal outcomes, including at least a minimal credit for natural gas. Most recently, EPSA has offered several recommendations to improve and increase competitive bidding in the Clean Electricity Performance Program, or CEP, which was included in proposals for President Biden and the Democrats' climate plan, and as of now appears to be out of the reconciliation package. Just for some background for you, our primary concern was that the CEP would simply serve as a blank check to monopoly utilities without ensuring that clean energy resources would be built and procured at least cost. Several competitive renewable developers noted that their companies are already working to build and develop these resources at competitive prices, and the CEP simply would have squeezed them out. So while the CEP has proven to be unworkable for now, we hope that policymakers can come back to the table with a more holistic, efficient, and cost-effective market-based solution like carbon pricing. Clearly, that policy presents its own set of political challenges, but if policymakers are looking for the most economically rational approach to reduce emissions, a carbon price is the best tool. Devil is always in the details, and what specific mechanism is applied? How do we address the global nature of emissions with a border adjustment? How do we determine the right price for carbon? And a host of other issues make this a very challenging task. But if policymakers are serious about addressing the issue, the generator community stands ready to work with them to try and find the best possible approach. What is clear is that a patchwork approach to clean energy policy that relies on fuel-specific subsidies and does not holistically address emissions reductions results in a far more expensive, less efficient, and even less effective outcome. Regional approaches that unleash competition are far better, and a national approach would clearly be optimal. As we look to the future about the grid and what its transition will look like, we must put reliability front and center. From our perspective, that's non-negotiable. As I mentioned before, this will require a sufficient amount of firm, flexible, dispatchable resources to support the growth of intermittent resources as electric demand increases. Ultimately, we believe that energy solutions should put consumers first, finding the most effective path to reduce emissions without sacrificing reliability. And in addition to its reliability benefits, natural gas is also part of a least cost, low emission transition to the future. It's clear it's in nearly every RTO, in Texas included in this instance, and every competitive market, there are critical conversations being held and decisions at stake that will determine the ability of these markets to deliver the reliable, cleaner energy future we all want. In PJM, FERC recently allowed a change to the capacity market rules to go into effect, which unfortunately will get us no closer to ensuring the market remains competitive and resources needed to provide reliability are fairly compensated. We see similar conversations around power market impact of subsidies being debated in the New York Independent System Operator and also in the New England area. Ultimately, EPSA is working with all parties and stakeholders to try and achieve a durable regulatory framework for sustainable environmental progress, meeting the regional needs and differences of each RTO while striving to ensure reliability. It's important to note there's been some criticism of the restructured markets around the country from some corners, and they've suggested that markets are not delivering on outcomes and consumers are not best served by them, and we would take some issue with that. A recent paper from Intelemetry, forgive me if I mispronounce that, did a deep dive on the impacts of Winter Storm Yuri and found that the competitive options were better for consumers and that nearly all consumers who shopped in Texas were immune from the spike in prices while their suppliers bore that risk, and that captive customers in Texas and the Midwest are being asked to pay billions in higher fuel costs because their incumbent utility was simply agnostic to that cost, knowing it would be passed on to consumers. So in summary, a number of studies have answered a few questions. Do competitive markets lead to reliability concerns? And the answer to that is no. The Baker Institute-led study recently published a paper to that effect. The Pacific Research Institute study from Dr. Wayne Weingarten said virtually the same thing. And the think tank R Street also filed an op-ed that dealt with many of these issues and came to the same conclusion. A second question we often hear is, do competitive markets lead to price volatility? That same Intelemetry study, again, apologies if I mispronounced it, found a couple of key points. The typical residential customer of a utility monopoly affected by the Winter Storm Yuri price spike will end up paying hundreds of dollars for a single week's worth of gas or power. In some cases, that total runs upwards of $2,000 when you combine the gas and electric customers in impacted states. As one utility executive put it, higher natural gas prices are pass-through costs for our business and did not impact that utility's quarterly results in terms of their earnings. When customers are given the right to shop, they can change suppliers who increase future prices to recoup their past losses. In utility monopoly markets, customers can't do that, and regulation in this case serves as a vehicle to ensure the monopoly's financial outcome at the expense of customers. The largest competitive market for retail customers, Texas, saw most residential customers insulated from that price volatility through fixed rate term energy plans. So, fixed rate contracts for a period of months or years. Texas energy providers who offered those plans were responsible for managing their business's energy costs, and those that did not went out of business. It won't surprise you, I don't think, to hear that we think that consumers bearing these costs is exactly the wrong outcome, and that properly designed and well-functioning wholesale and retail markets deliver real value to customers and shield them from that kind of situation. Competitive power suppliers are leading the nation when it comes to delivering sustainable energy solutions. But a sustainable future relies not just on reduced emissions or a continued industry commitment to meeting the highest environmental standard. It also relies on enabling what many have termed a just transition that does not unduly increase energy costs or create scenarios that threaten the ability of the system to meet the nation's 24/7 reliance on electricity. It's clear that environmental sustainability efforts need to be paired with a thoughtful transition of power generation fleet to support the three pillars of a grid that can meet our energy future: reliable, affordable, and cleaner electricity. I'll close with the following. Competitive generators are ready to deliver on the goals that policymakers and society are aiming for. We also understand that should there be a reliability issue, it will be our members who are called to account and who very clearly want to generate the power that is needed to safely, reliably, and affordably deliver the least amount of emissions possible while still being able to earn a fair rate of return on our investments. And we have a 20+ year track record of doing that to show how we can be trusted to deliver on that objective. However, there also need to be fact-based, data-driven reality checks on where we actually are, where we are headed, and how we will get there to ensure that policymakers and the public understand fully the cost, timelines, and challenges to overcome in delivering reliable power at affordable prices with the least emissions. In the spirit of that ambitious goal, I'm of course happy to answer any questions about these issues and about how EPSA and our members are engaged on them. So I again, thank you for the opportunity to be with you, and I very much look forward to the question and answers.
Okay, thank you very much, Todd. So yeah, we got a few questions coming in here. So yeah, take a swig of water. One of them is referring to something you said at the pretty early on about this new natural gas facility in Pennsylvania, kind of a combined cycle, highly efficient. The question here is, does it have any features as being CO2 capture ready, or how? Maybe you could speak more generally as well on EPSA's viewpoint on, I don't know, carbon capture, and maybe it just says, apply a carbon price and we'll see who builds it. I don't know what, but go for that topic.
Sure, that's a great question. I don't know that it is currently equipped for carbon capture and sequestration ready. I don't know the answer to that question. I will tell you more broadly that we view CCS as a possible alternative, and one of the ways that innovation can spur the continued utilization of some of our existing resources, but certainly the resources that are going to be needed to ensure reliability in the future. And certainly we have made that position known to policymakers in DC as they are actively debating where they will make investments in the tax code, it appears, since the SEP is now apparently off the table. And so the ability for us to see development and application of carbon capture is fundamentally important as we look at how we think we may be able to achieve those objectives going forward.
Very well, thanks. Yeah, more questions coming in. Here's one kind of early. This is getting into some weeds, I guess some good weeds though.
Okay.
As the questions on and how do you see the role of the questions about changes in ancillary service markets, but maybe more generally, what is the role of ancillary service markets, which we have more in here in ERCOT than perhaps not a capacity market per se, and how do you think various proposed changes, or does EPSA have a position on how you define these to be, as you stated, kind of early, try to be neutral in terms of technology, but every time you define one of these little services, it's got some little quirk to it. And, just because of the nature of different technologies will affect them differently. So how do we, do you have ancillary services you like, or how do we think about this? And
how should we think about it?
I'll say neutral, first,
I'll say first that we have not weighed in on the Texas debate over where that market would be, because it's non-FERC jurisdictional. It's not a place that we typically wade in unless we're invited by our members. And so they have not made that invitation. So I'll speak more broadly about that. But I think one of the other items that was included in that E3 study that I mentioned a couple of times during my remarks is that the basic structure of the market in the Eastern RTOs is sound, in that it has an energy, a capacity, and an ancillary service component. One of the issues that we often find is that there is some fatigue around capacity. It's been painted to be this the problem child that's preventing things from getting onto the system and keeping other resources on that should otherwise exit the system. Whether or not we agree or disagree, there is some discussion about, well, can revenue be earned through the ancillary service market in order to resolve some of those questions? And thus far, there has not been a compelling case made that the ancillary service market is where those revenues can sufficiently be generated in order to allow resources to remain online. That being said, FERC has done a 2-day conference to deal with energy and ancillary service issues to try and get to the bottom of what some of those reforms may need to look like. And EPSA is internally working on what we think are some things that we would hope to be a package of ideas that could be presented to the RTOs or to FERC in order to say, we think this is the model that would sustain things going forward. I'd love to tell you that we had resolved that issue and it was straightforward. But as you would imagine, there are a wide variety of views about how we may want to tackle that. But I think the important starting point is that the existing market structure shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And that was the conclusion that E3 has made and others about the importance of having the 3-tier system, the energy, capacity, and ancillary service markets. How those will change and evolve over time, I think, is certainly what is driving much of this discussion, as states have made clear, certainly in the PJM area, that they are uncomfortable with, perhaps having to pay twice because of resources that they support and want to bring on the grid. Is that going to be an issue that arises under a capacity construct? Are challenging issues that need to be resolved. And there's no easy answer to that. And so PJM is actively going through a process to try and address many of these issues. We, I'm sure among others, are having internal discussions about how we may want to approach those, because this right really sets the path forward, and getting it wrong has the ability to hinder the deployment of additional resources and really limit what can be done by market participants that ultimately benefit consumers. And so we're deeply engaged in it. I'd love to tell you I have all the answers and let me lay it out for you as a newsworthy item, but frankly, we're not quite there yet, but we're up to our elbows in it, and our members are deeply engaged on trying to find the right answer to have a workable path forward.
Right. Skip ahead to a question that I think relates to some of the comments you just kind of made there at the end.
Sure.
I mean, I guess in some sense, I suppose by definition, you represent power generators. And it's the question here in terms of securing a future reliable grid and competitive markets, that it's not just about generation, it's about, it can be other things, energy efficiency, demand response, and trying to facilitate these kinds of things, which then fits in sort of the question of ancillary services and, even aside from generation type requirements. So is it a fair statement that EPSA essentially sort of promotes, this is sort of the question here, promotes generation and just sort of either remain silent or maybe not even talk against demand side kind of reductions? Or how do you kind of walk that line?
Yeah, it's a fair question. We clearly advocate on behalf of the generator community because we want to make sure that they have the opportunity to do what they do. As you look at where the projections go, and I know, and our members agree that energy efficiency, it's the, how does the adage go? It's the cheapest megawatt that you get is the one you never have to use. So they're not opposed to the deployment of energy efficiency tools, but they have to, as you look at how the grid is going to have increased demand, you're still, even with efficiency, you're going to continue to see a need for significant amounts of generation, both existing and newly constructed, in order to meet those high or even medium electrification scenarios that have been modeled. So I don't view it as an either or, it's a both and. I think you will see continued use of energy efficiency for the reasons noted. I know that the Portman-Shaheen bill that was passed a couple of years ago and is very focused on energy efficiency as a way to minimize costs and help businesses to be able to compete. And we don't oppose that. But at the same time, we're going to continue to see increased demand with electrification. And as we see that, there's going to be a need for more generating resources. You can't ultimately get to zero with energy efficiency. At some point, you're still going to need those electrons on the system. So striking the right balance will be critical. We don't typically take a position advocating for efficiency or against efficiency. We're more focused on, as the pie grows, how can we help fill it? And whether it's a smaller or larger slice of efficiency or DER, that's ultimately something that can be addressed through market tools and mechanisms. And we found that to be the case in multiple markets around the country.
Right. You might have just answered the follow-up question I was going to have, which is, I guess, since you promote, markets or wholesale markets and therefore pricing signals with carbon, you're saying that inherently, do you believe, well, this should signal demand response options to reduce peak demand, and including things like charging electric vehicles and how to coordinate that kind of timing. Is that a fair statement?
I think so. And as I mentioned, a number of our member companies are invested in some of those other areas that are outside of our charge in dealing with wholesale power related issues, but are very much invested in that space because they see the electrification scenario evolving in real time. the number of electric cars continues to grow up. That is the one item that everybody seems to be, it's tangible, right? Everybody's heard of Tesla. They've seen a Tesla. They can kind of relate to it, as opposed to some of the commercial and industrial applications that we don't run into or see. And so I think you see members taking a perspective that says, we get where this is headed, and we're invested. Some, not all, are invested in that space. But even with that as one of the tools, we still want to make sure that the market will function adequately to ensure reliability. There are some who would suggest that, well, it's time for all of these old fossil resources to just move off the system, and we'll get to 100% renewables in very short order. And while that's an admirable aspirational goal, the practical reality is we can't do it yet. And even those entities that have made long-term commitments to emission reductions will tell you, we think we can probably get to 80% emissions reductions by 2030, 2040, 2050, pick your timeline. But that last 20% is very difficult and very expensive. And so that's where innovation will come in and have a part to play in trying to address that final 20% to help us get there. And our members are comfortable investing in that space. So I think it runs parallel with many of the things that we've been talking about these last couple of questions. It's not exclusive. And it's not as if we don't think that there are going to be other pieces that are going to impact how that works. But it's a technological evolution, and it's an adaptability situation where we're going to find ourselves 5 to 10 years from now in a very different place than we are today. And I count myself as not an excellent prognosticator, so I won't suggest that I know where we're going to land, but I feel very confident in saying we're going to be at a different place then than we are today.
Right. I can't predict the future either. So
if I could, I'd probably have a different job.
Right. There's a comment of someone, taking advantage of online presentations and searching the web and things like this during it. But it's just sort of commenting on that EPSA, I guess, has stated position. You've stated it here, promoting economy-wide carbon pricing as part of at least electricity wholesale markets and passed on through retail. So the question here is a little bit more on any specific efforts to lobby that. Does EPSA sort of lobby that? Has it signed on to agreements of the climate fee and dividend, carbon fee and dividend, or any of these other kinds of proposals?
Sure, great question. Our members have a variety of approaches, and so we don't want to get ahead of our members on where they stand. Some are on the carbon dividend plan, others are on more of a carbon fee. So we have to take one step back. But as part of the reconciliation bill in particular, we made a point to go to the members of the Senate in particular who were debating whether or not they wanted to take the SEP and include it. Was that going to survive Senator Manchin's review? And say, look, in the event that this doesn't pass muster, and frankly is even better than that, would be the carbon price. And there were a number of senators on the Finance Committee and elsewhere who support a carbon price. And we did very much go to them and say, this is the more economically rational approach. It is a much more sound approach if you're trying to address some of the concerns that you raise about emissions reductions. This helps create the competitive, innovative model that makes sense for us. Ultimately, it doesn't appear that we have yet been successful on that, but much like our position, you'll note that the American Petroleum Institute recently said that they support an economy-wide price on carbon. The U.S. Chamber has said that they now support an economy-wide price on carbon. And the Business Roundtable has said that they too support an economy-wide price on carbon. So there does appear to be some growing support from the business community around that, even amongst those who are impacted by what the carbon fee might be. But understanding where society is trying to get to, what's the most effective mechanism for us to get there? So we have advocated for that, and we'll continue to do so because we think it is the most rational economic approach to get there. And it allows our members the opportunity to thoughtfully figure out how to compete going forward, as opposed to, in effect, having some other approach that essentially shuts them down.
Right. Well, if I can phrase a question out of this, but there's a couple comments that are related to things we've certainly heard since Winter Storm Yuri here in Texas, and since we have a decent amount of customers that are within whatever quote unquote monopoly or captive markets, whether they're cooperatives or municipal utilities, like here in Austin and Austin Energy, it came out on the good end in terms of Winter Storm Yuri, and in some sense, to a degree, and made money, had more generation available, and we had to curtail power and sold more power than we generated in the city, and this kind of thing. So that the results are somewhat implied by your Baker Institute reference that they can vary within competitive and non-competitive areas, but everybody competes still selling electricity in the wholesale market. So they're still all doing that, even if they have the customers are captive. So This is there, since you there's a as a sentiment that there's some benefits to being let's say municipal utility in terms of pairing up efficiency and demand response with generation and things like this. So do you have anything else to say about the pros and cons? Obviously Austin Energy didn't sell natural gas as a utility, and CPS did, and they're kind of having lawsuits over mostly the natural gas. So right. I'll throw one. This is kind of maybe my real question here. That's a comment that you can comment on, but the question might be how do we phrase markets, or how do we view markets in an emergency? I look at this and I think, well, this is a declared emergency by the governors, and
sure,
why would we be using market mechanisms instead of including natural gas pricing that is influenced by a non-market price set in the wholesale market of electricity in Texas? It all gets complicated, and I fear that people can't follow it when an emergency comes, and then we end up with billions of dollars transferring that didn't have to.
Yeah, you raised the $64 billion question, perhaps. It used to be $64,000 question. But, the challenge, I think, really comes down to, as you look at the evaluation that was done about what happened in Texas, and I will try to be very careful not to declare that I'm a Texas expert as a non-Texan, but looking in and reading the reports and the studies and the analyses that have been done, there was a system failure across the entire energy system. It wasn't merely a generator failure. It wasn't merely a wind failure or a gas generators or coal. There was wellhead freezes. There were utility shutoffs that maybe shouldn't have been shut off. When you're turning off compressor stations because they participate in your demand response program when you need them the most, that seems to be an improper way for you to manage your circuits. And so there were a number of things that cascaded into a terrible event. And I think it's safe to say that, market or not, no one wants an outcome like that again, if it's at all possible. And so we would view it and say that a properly designed market that properly compensates and rewards people who can perform and show up, who are going to be able to secure the resources that are needed, and then ultimately they are supplied by those who have on the other side of the contract, and no force majeure is declared, and they end up being short of supply and can't run at the capacity they are committed to run, are things that need to be addressed in order to ensure that the system can operate in a way that is safe and reliable. As we look at situations, there's been cold snaps. We called it the polar vortex when I was the chair of the Public Utilities Commission that swept across the PJM region, and it was very cold and there were outages, but the system survived because the market responded and units that were supposed to run were able to run. There were sufficient reserve margins to ensure that reliable power was delivered, and there were presumably better control over where the demand response pieces may have been on the playing field, so to speak, that allowed PJM to carefully navigate two polar vortexes over 2 separate years and not have a reliability problem or an outage or even rolling blackouts. And so I think there are demonstrated examples of where a market situation, even an emergency, can still perform. But when you have a series of cascading events that lead to failures that grow every time the next layer is impacted, as appeared to have happened in Winter Storm Yuri, I don't know that it's as much a market failure as it was more of a systemic failure from all the parts of the system having touch points that didn't connect in ways that were thoughtful and in ways that resulted in maybe some decisions being made that in hindsight weren't perhaps the best decision. So I don't know that it was purely a market failure. Having looked at other markets, you clearly can survive an emergency, even in a market setting. So I think there was a broader set of issues that perhaps were more problematic than just saying, well, if it were only a vertically integrated or a municipal or a co-op, then you'd have been okay, because that wasn't exactly accurate either. There were places in MISO and SPP that had rotating outages because they had the same kind of issues, but those are vertically integrated territories. So it's not purely a markets function. I think when you have a catastrophe happening and there's not good line of sight between all of the parts of the energy value chain, that's why you end up in a bad situation like Winter Storm Yuri.
Right. Well, if we have a physical failure, let's just say we had a physical failure of the exact same thing that happened in Yuri here in Texas. If it was still fully regulated, my guess is there would not have been billions of dollars of transfer of money, because the pricing mechanisms wouldn't have been set up. The wholesale market, there wouldn't be, this gets too much into ERCOT, an ORDC curve that defines an upper limit. Those things wouldn't have existed, and there would have been a disaster, but it wouldn't have, cost as much money.
Well, I think and I'm going to say the name wrong, but the Intellometry study
Yep.
suggests that that's actually not the case, because even those utilities that were able to get supply paid whatever the prices were. I can't project, well, if we'd only had a completely different model, the prices wouldn't be what they were. But where the prices were, those costs are being passed on to ratepayers, and they have no choice but to pay them. And that may be a 30-year securitized payment based on the size of some of those costs that we're going to have to be passed on to consumers.
Right. Okay. Well, we'll put that one to bed. Here's some, there's been several articles, and there's one in the Wall Street Journal. This is one question here. I know some colleagues here at UT debated this Wall Street Journal article. I can't remember, it was last year or a year ago, something like this, discussing, it was, I guess, particular to Texas, whether deregulated areas had spent more money on retail power or monopoly areas. So yeah, do you have any thoughts on that? Is this something we can even determine definitively, kind of like we're maybe discussing now? Is this even a question you can determine definitively, given how much technology changed from the beginning of in gas prices, from the beginning of the wholesale market in Texas to now? I have my doubts whether we can actually even know an answer.
Yeah, I think pinpointing that would be rather difficult. So I'll take two steps back and speak more broadly and say that, I think that journal, while I generally have high regard for the journal, I think that story was pretty misleading. I think if you look at what people are actually buying when you purchase competitively procured options, you're not necessarily only buying the least cost alternative. I mean, Gritty was supposed to be the least cost alternative, and those poor souls that were on that program when Yuri happened paid the price for it. But if you are on a fixed price contract for 12 months and you go through a Winter Storm Yuri event and your price doesn't change, but your supplier bears all that risk, but you might pay more than you would otherwise pay with a utility that's then going to charge you for the higher costs later on. Does that mean that you were ripped off? Does that mean that somehow you didn't get a deal that you thought was valuable? Well, I think you'd have to go through all the machinations of calculating what the costs were for your contract versus what you're going to pay to a regulated utility, where you're now going to pay for 10, 15, whatever the number of years are to pay off that fuel cost that's being passed on to you. So I think it oversimplifies in a number of ways what you're actually buying when you secure a retail contract. And ultimately, I trust consumers to make good decisions. They don't all make good decisions, but I don't always make a good decision when I look at my cell phone plan. If I probably could choose a cheaper plan than I'm on, but I'm either lazy, or I think the value that I'm getting is worth what I'm spending, or it's inertia and I just don't feel like going to the store and wrestling with them like buying a car. And so I keep the plan that I have. Does that mean that I'm being ripped off or that I'm being overcharged? I would say no. But if you want to look at a really inexpensive plan that still would allow me to make cell calls versus the Cadillac plan that I may have that allows unlimited data and everything, well, what's the right price? Well, I don't know that there is a right price, but I know that the value of the commodity that I'm buying is different, and there was probably going to be a price difference as a result of that.
In terms, here's sort of questions from one of our carbon capture research gurus here at UTES, just kind of asking more questions on that. Is there anything more you can say about EPSA's position on carbon capture, or maybe large, should, it's hard in the current definition of wholesale markets to, for someone to want to invest in that from like how's it operating right now, because there's no carbon price, right? So is there a role for government to just say, hey, let's just build some of these suckers and government just pay for them and let's do it and figure it out? We have one in Texas here that Petronova project, and then they shut it down. So it's not making money, but did we learn? Should we build another one and make the next one better if we think we're going to need this going forward for dispatchability? And it's kind of to get to those last 20% of low carbon emissions, as you sort of said, on the grid. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think we look at it as the government should be involved in doing the applied research to get things from, across, what do they call that? The canyon of death or whatever, where you're trying to get from study to commercial application. And if we're not there yet, then that's the appropriate place for research dollars to go. Once we figure out the science, can the vacuum work that a number of companies are looking at to try and basically pull carbon through a big engine, for lack of a better word, and pull the carbon out of the air? If that works and it's already commercial, should we continue to have it subsidized by the government? We would say no. I mean, if it's technology that's trying to get across that canyon and into a commercial deployment, well, that's where research dollars need to be spent in order to help us achieve those objectives. But once that's met, then those technologies are more rapidly adopted, frankly, by our members, because they now see a market opportunity to differentiate themselves, be able to apply that to either an existing or a new resource, and put themselves in a competitive position that advantages them over other units that may be still emitting carbon. And if we get to the place where there is a price on carbon, they would then not have to pay it, because you'd be able to clean some or all of your carbon out of your stack, and that would be a benefit to you. So we're not opposed to it. In fact, our members are interested in trying to figure out how that can be commercially deployed. But is it ready today? I don't think so. But I know 45Q, and there was talk of expanding CCS research and dollars to be spent via DOE, all appear to be on the table for part of the discussion in the reconciliation bill. And from our position, I don't think that's something that we're opposed to, so long as it's the development phase, not the we're going to pay company X to put it on their system and they'll benefit to our detriment. That's where the line between research and picking winners and losers would be drawn.
Right. Yeah, and let's see. So I was going to make a comment, but our person commenting here, our guru here, is saying he thinks that the technology is ready today, in terms of, let's just say, conventional amine scrubbing of flue gases.
Okay.
For carbon capture, it's an issue of price, certainly. So I guess the claim would be it works, and we're just waiting.
Now we're negotiating price, right?
Yeah. Maybe I'll end on this question. Is maybe a little bit still on the general carbon question,
Sure.
of carbon pricing. Is there anything you can say, and maybe you can't because it's too difficult for you to parse it out amongst your members, but what might be any significant differences? And maybe there are tiny differences, I don't know, but the differences that the different groups of members, you don't have to say who they are, of course, but
Sure.
there's a group that says this, and there's a group that kind of thinks this, and it's different.
Yeah, there are some members who support the dividend plan, where money would come in and then be paid back out in the form of a dividend. There are others who are more supportive of a more traditional carbon price that would be applied. And there are those who also have suggested to us, and I don't know if any member has adopted this position, but as you look at some of the structural deficits that exist, if we were to find ourselves applying a carbon price, if that revenue could then be deployed to either fund some of the social programs like Social Security and Medicare that are on the track for bankruptcy, or would help pay down the national debt, there are those who suggest that that would be a useful use for that revenue that would be generated. So I think we're kind of across the board, and I don't want to say that anybody has adopted that pay down the debt perspective, but that's one of the ideas that is out there. And so I think the challenge becomes, what's the number? And if you saw the hearing last week where the executives from the oil and natural gas companies had to testify in Congress, there was certainly some pretty strident questions about, well, what's the right price? You must know what the right price is. And it's more complicated than simply saying $10 or $100 or $40. But if you look at the analysis that E3 did, it was a relatively modest carbon price. I believe it was $40 a ton in PJM was what got you those savings and significant emission reductions over the business as usual case. So it's not as if the number has to be some astronomical number to have the desired effect. It's then the mechanism that you deploy in order to either ratchet it up or determine what technologies will qualify, et cetera. So the general principles are relatively straightforward. It's the details that get complicated, because if it's your ox being gored, it's different than if it's my ox being gored, and people get relatively territorial about if it's their ox.
Right. Wondering if there was anything more than just, maybe what's happening in any given area, and whether the company's played in that area or not. I would comment and encourage you to pursue the thought of the government funding and how sort of money creation works, in the sense that Social Security is not funded by the taxes of Social Security. It is the government spends money. By definition, when they spend money, it produces money in the economy, so they can always pay off Social Security. So I think this is some of the frustration with people, in particular Manchin, and saying it's got to be paid for, and people argue, no, there's no such thing as pay for. The government spends money, federal government they create the money and they spend it. It's just whether they tax enough to pay for that or not, whether it's a B-1 bomber or a carbon capture plant.
And that strikes me as a debate for another day.
Yeah, that's a little, yeah, certainly a debate for another day. Well, I think and see if there's a question here that's it's sort of a similar question on the carbon plans. I mean, it started to ask, is there a pattern between why one group likes a carbon fee and dividend versus just a straight up price, or is it just, what?
Yeah, I don't know that there's a pattern. I think it's a company preference. Some of our member companies were early joiners of the CLC and are fully invested in the work that's being done there. Others have taken some more time to get to the position that they've adopted. So I don't know that there's a clean break between company X and company Y based on generation portfolios or what have you. I think people would be surprised that even some of our companies that own some of the older, higher emitting resources are supportive of a carbon price, where you might logically say, well, they're the ones that must be opposed to it, where they're not opposed to it. In fact, our entire board voted to reaffirm our support for a carbon price. Excellent.
Well, I thank everybody for the good questions coming in here. And Todd Snitchler, of President CEO of EPSA, thank you very much for joining us here on UT Energy.